Jesus commanded you to tear out your eye and cut off your hand, and in 2,000 years, practically no Christian has done it. Not one. Not the martyrs, not the monks, not the saints, not the reformers, not the pastor of your church, not you. We all read those words, we all nod our heads, and we all go on with both eyes in place. And we're all right, because nobody serious believes Jesus literally wanted you to mutilate yourself. It's a hyperbole, a deliberate exaggeration, a way of speaking that any Jewish listener of the first century would have recognized instantly. That's well established. But notice what just happened. You just decided that a direct order from the Nazarene does not mean what it says. And the moment you did that, you walked into the most uncomfortable problem in the entire history of Christianity. Because if tear out your eye is a figure of speech, what happens with do not resist the one who is evil? What happens with love your enemies? What happens with do not swear at all? What happens with do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth? Which of those words are poetry and which are commandment? And who decides? That's the Sermon on the Mount, 3 chapters, Matthew 5, 6, and 7, the most quoted discourse in human history. The text Gandhi read every day without being a Christian. The words Tolstoy said ruined his life. The passage that put the Anabaptists in front of the executioner and Bonhoeffer in front of the gallows. And also, without any exaggeration, the most systematically evaded set of instructions in the history of religion. Today, you're not going to hear a devotional tour through the Beatitudes. You're going to see something different and considerably more disturbing. The story of how 2,000 years of Christianity built system after system, school after school, theology after theology, with a single practical result. To explain to you with enormous sophistication why you don't have to obey this. 5 great escapes, all of them intelligent, all of them with texts in their favor, all of them signed by giants, and all of them ending up in exactly the same place. Before we go on, something quick, and I promise it's short. If this is the first time you've landed on this channel, I'm asking you for absolutely nothing. Stay, listen, and if at the end this gave you nothing, you leave, and that's that. No commitment at all. But if you've been here before, if you've already sat down with me in other videos, and you know how we work this, then I ask you for one gesture now, before it really starts. Hit the like now, not for me, but for the person who doesn't yet know he needs to hear this. That button decides whether the video reaches him or not. You already know the house. The ones just arriving don't. That thumb is for them. All right, let's go to the hillside. The year 30, more or less. Nobody can give you an exact date, and whoever gives you one is making it up. Northern Galilee. Green territory, humid, agricultural, very different from the dry Judea of the south. Villages of black basalt stone. A lake the locals simply called the sea, although any Roman would have laughed at their calling a lake about 13 miles long a sea. Boats, nets, the smell of salted fish curing in the sun. And a man who had spent months doing strange things. Because by the time this discourse comes, the rabbi from Nazareth already has a reputation. Matthew 4:24 says it without hedging. His name ran throughout Syria, and they brought him the sick, the demon-possessed, the paralyzed, people with pains of every kind. He's no longer an unknown climbing a hill. He's a phenomenon. People walk for days to see him, and then he goes up. Matthew 5:1. Seeing the crowds, he went up on the mountain, and when he sat down, his disciples came to him. Stop on that verse, because there's more information hidden there than it seems. First, he sat down. That's not a decorative detail. Sitting was the posture of the teacher. The rabbi sat, the disciples stood or sat on the ground around him. Even today, we say a professor holds a chair, and the word comes from the seat he sat in. When the Nazarene sits down on that hillside, he's formally assuming the role of authorized teacher. He's not improvising, he's teaching. Second, he went up on the mountain, And very early, we have to make the first honesty stop of the video, because there are two things you probably believe about that mountain, and neither of them is in the Bible. The first thing you believe is that we know which mountain it is. We don't. The Greek text says, to oros, the mountain, the mount. No name, no location, no coordinates. Matthew doesn't tell you which one it was. Mark doesn't tell you which one it was. Luke doesn't even mention a mountain, and we'll get to that problem. No gospel names that place. What exists today, that beautiful site the pilgrims go to, that green hill above the lake with the white octagonal church at the top, is called the Mount of Beatitudes. It's a lovely place. It's a deeply moving place. And it's a tradition, not a fact. The identification with that specific hill, near Tabgha and Capernaum, goes back to the Byzantine era. And there was a small ancient chapel there. But the church you see in the photos, the one that appears in absolutely every documentary, was designed by the architect Antonio Barluzzi and finished in 1938. It's younger than many of the grandparents of the people who visit it, and nothing happens. Really, nothing happens. A tradition can be beautiful and useful without being historical. But if you're going to talk about this sermon seriously, you have to be capable of separating what the text says from what the tourist brochure says. Because that distinction, exactly that one, is going to be the tool we use for this entire video. And you're going to need it much later on, when we get to things considerably bigger than a hill. The second thing you believe is that it was a sermon. And this does get interesting. Look at what Matthew does. He goes up the mountain, sits down, and unloads 3 consecutive chapters of continuous teaching. Beatitudes, salt and light, the law, the antitheses, almsgiving, prayer, fasting, money, anxiety, judgment, the narrow gate, the false prophets, the 2 houses. And then, Matthew 7:28. When he had finished these words, the people were astonished at his teaching. One piece, one block, one discourse. Now open Luke 6:17. And he came down with them and stood on a level place. A level place, not a mountain, a plain. And there in that flat place, Luke puts a discourse that has beatitudes, has love of enemies, has the other cheek, has judge not, has the speck and the log, has the tree and its fruits, has the house on the rock. It's the same material. It's recognizably the same message. And it's a quarter of the size. What's going on? Some say they're 2 different occasions. That Jesus was an itinerant preacher, that itinerant preachers repeat their material, and that he could perfectly well have given one discourse on a hillside and another similar one on a plain weeks later. It's a reasonable explanation, and there are serious people who defend it. And there's another explanation, which is the one that dominates academic scholarship, and it's this: Matthew is an editor. The idea is that Matthew, who writes probably between the year 80 and 90, had in front of him a mass of sayings of the Christ. Loose teachings pronounced at different moments in different places, before different audiences, over years. And instead of giving them to you scattered, he organized them. He grouped them by theme. He assembled them into 5 great blocks of teaching, 5 discourses, distributed throughout his gospel, each one closed with the same formula: when Jesus had finished these words. 5. That number has made a lot of people's eyes light up, because 5 are also the books of Moses, and there's a very elegant proposal, defended above all by the researcher Dale Allison in his book The New Moses from 1993, according to which Matthew is deliberately constructing a parallel: a child who escapes a king, who kills baby boys, just like Moses, a coming out of Egypt, a passage through the waters, the baptism, 40 days in the wilderness, like the 40 years, and then a man who goes up a mountain and comes down with the law, a new Moses, a new Sinai, a new Torah. It's absolutely beautiful. And I need to be very clear with you about one thing. It's a proposal. It's not a fact. It's a literary reading argued by competent specialists. and it has real support in the text, but it also has serious critics. The commentator Ulrich Lutz, who wrote probably the most monumental commentary on Matthew of the last half-century, is explicitly cautious with the new Moses thesis and warns that it's been pushed further than the text allows. Others point out that Matthew never calls the rabbi from Galilee the new Moses, that in the antitheses Jesus places himself above Moses rather than beside him, and that the parallel works better in the essay than in the gospel. I'm not going to tell you the thesis is false. I'm going to tell you what it is, a strong and disputed hypothesis. And you're going to remember this distinction between what the text says and what someone very intelligent proposed about the text, because in about an hour we're going to reach the point where ignoring that difference cost the entire church 2 millennia of confusion. Now, having said all that, I want us to do something. I want you to forget for a moment the analysis, the Greek, the commentators, the dates, and I want you to go up there. It's early. The sun is still low over the lake, and the water is flat as oil. The grass on the hillside is wet and soaks your feet, because in Galilee in spring, that hill fills up with grass and yellow flowers. It smells of wet earth and of livestock. And around you there are hundreds of people. They're not theologians. Almost none of them can read. They're peasants with broken fingernails, fishermen with hands hardened and burned, women with children hanging off their hips, a man who 3 weeks ago couldn't walk and who now doesn't move a yard away from the master. Poor people, people in debt, people who owe the tax collector, who owe the landowner, who owe the temple, and who know perfectly well that man sitting on the rock can do nothing against Rome. And all of them have come with a very concrete expectation. They've come to be told that they are the good ones, the occupied, the humiliated, the ones who pay taxes to a Caesar who calls himself divine, the ones who watch the Roman cavalry ride past on their dirt road. They are the chosen people, and this is the promised land, and it's full of foreigners with spears. Any preacher with 2 fingers of forehead knows what this crowd wants to hear. It wants to hear that God is going to settle accounts. It wants to hear blood. And the man on the rock opens his mouth, and the first thing he says, the very first thing before anything else, is that the blessed are the poor. Not the strong, not the avengers, not the ones who are going to throw the Romans into the sea. The poor, those who mourn, the meek, those who hunger, those who make peace. And something breaks on that hillside, because the most radical inversion of values ever pronounced has just begun, and none of them, absolutely none of them, knows yet that within 3 chapters that same man is going to tell them that if they hear all this and don't do it, they're an idiot who built his house on sand. Let's go to the Beatitudes. And I'll warn you right now, the first great escape in the history of Christianity begins exactly here in verse 3, and you probably already practice it without knowing. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Matthew 5:3. The opening line, the word we translate as blessed is makarios. And you have to be careful with that word, because modern translations turn it into happy, and that's a disaster. Makarios does not describe an emotional state. It doesn't mean you're cheerful. It doesn't mean you're smiling. In classical Greek, it was even used for the gods and for the dead, who were already in the beyond, people whose situation was settled, secured, out of danger. It's a declaration about your position, not about your mood. Translating it as happy turns the sermon into a self-help manual, and the sermon is not a self-help manual. It's a declaration about who the kingdom belongs to, and who it belongs to, according to this first sentence, is the poor. The poor in spirit, says Matthew, patokoi to pneumati. And now open Luke chapter 6, verse 20, and read what it says there. Blessed are you who are poor, for yours is the kingdom of God. The poor, period. No in spirit. No qualifier, no escape hatch. There you have it. Two versions of the same saying, in two Gospels that are inside your Bible, on the same shelf, 40 pages apart. One spiritualizes the poverty, the other doesn't, and this would already be uncomfortable. But Luke isn't finished, because Luke does something Matthew doesn't do at all. After his Beatitudes, Luke puts the woes, Luke 6:24. But woe to you who are rich, for you have already received your comfort. Woe to you who are full now, for you shall be hungry. Woe to you who laugh now, for you shall mourn and weep. Woe to you when all men speak well of you. 4 curses. 4. And they're aimed at the rich, at the satisfied, at those who laugh, and at those with a good reputation. Matthew has 0. Think for a moment about what that means for you, concretely. Think about how many sermons you've heard in your life about blessed are the poor in spirit. Hundreds probably. Now think about how many you've heard about woe to you who are rich, for you have already received your comfort. 1. None. There it is. That's the first escape. And it wasn't invented by any 19th century German theologian. You practice it, I practice it, your church practices it, and we all practice it every Sunday with a simple unconscious decision about which gospel to quote. We choose Matthew. Now, to be fair, and I want to be fair, there are legitimate reasons to prefer Matthew, and not all of them are cowardice. The first is that poor in spirit is not a later Christian invention to soften the blow. It's ancient Jewish language, and we have the physical proof. Among the Dead Sea manuscripts in the scroll known as the War Rule, there appears an expression usually translated precisely as the poor in spirit or the humble of spirit, and it describes the faithful members of the community. And there's more. In Cave 4 at Qumran, a fragmentary text turned up, catalogued as 4Q525, containing a series of chained beatitudes with a structure very similar to Matthew's, which means that the blessed is the one who format existed in Hebrew in Second Temple Judaism before the Messiah. Matthew isn't inventing a genre, he's using one. The second reason is that poverty in the Old Testament already came loaded with spiritual meaning. The Hebrew anor, the poor one, the humble one, is at once the one who has no money and the one who has nothing but God. Both things are together in the Psalms. There's no clean border, fine. All of that is true. And now the uncomfortable part. None of it explains why Luke put the woes and we ignore them. Because the word Luke uses for poor is tokos. And tokos in Greek is not the worker who just barely makes it to the end of the month. That's Painis, the one who lives off his work. Tokos comes from a verb that means to crouch, to cower. It's the beggar, the one who huddles, the one who has absolutely nothing and depends on the alms of the passerby. When Jesus looks at that crowd and says, "Blessed are you who are poor," in Luke's version, he's looking at people who crouch down to beg, and he isn't consoling them for their interior attitude. He's telling them the kingdom is theirs. I'm not going to resolve this tension for you. I can't, and whoever tells you they can is selling you something. The only thing I ask is that you see the pattern, because it's going to repeat itself for 2,000 years in ever more elegant forms. The pattern is this: there's a hard version and a soft version. And always, always, always we end up quoting the soft one. Let's keep going down the list because there's more in every line than you think. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. The verb is pentheo, and it's not just any sadness, it's mourning, grief over a death. It's the word used when someone has died on you and you're tearing your clothes. It doesn't say, blessed are the melancholy. It says, blessed are those in mourning. Mourning for what? The text doesn't specify, and there are two ancient readings. Mourning for one's own sin, say some, repentance to the point of tears. Mourning for the state of the world, say others, for the injustice, for the occupation, for the whole disaster, probably both. And in any case, the promise is in the passive. They shall be comforted. By whom? There's only one candidate. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. I need you to pay attention because this verse is a literal quotation and almost nobody knows it. Psalm 37 verse 11. But the meek shall inherit the land and shall delight themselves in the abundance of peace. Word for word. The man on the rock is not improvising a pretty phrase. He's quoting the Psalter in front of people who knew it by heart. And in Psalm 37, the context is brutally concrete. It's a poem about why the wicked prosper and the righteous don't. And the psalm's answer is that the wicked are going to wither like the grass, and the land is going to end up in the hands of the others. And that word, the earth, in the Hebrew of the psalm is eretz, and eretz means earth, yes, but it also means the country, the land, that land. The one that was full of Roman soldiers while Jesus was speaking. The listeners on that hillside did not hear an ethereal promise about the planet. They heard a promise about their occupied country, and they heard that it wasn't going to be recovered by the violent. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. The word is dikaiosune, and it's one of the most slippery in the New Testament. It can mean justice in a moral sense, doing what's right. It can mean justice in a social sense, things being set right. And in Paul it also means the righteousness God imputes to you. Matthew uses it 7 times, and in this sermon he clearly pushes toward conduct, toward a rightness that is practiced, but the image he chooses is visceral, hunger and thirst. It doesn't say, those who value justice. It says those who need it the way they need to eat. And then come the merciful, the pure in heart, the peacemakers. Stop on that one, the peacemakers. Irenopoioi, those who make peace. Not those who enjoy it, not those who want it, not those who put a bumper sticker on the car. The ones who manufacture it. And in the year 30, in Galilee, peace had an owner. It was called the Pax Romana, and it was manufactured with legions. The Emperor Augustus was, officially, on the coins and in the inscriptions, the pacifier of the world, the one who brought the peace. And this peasant preacher, sitting on a stone in front of a handful of fishermen, has just said that those who make peace shall be called sons of God. Sons of God was also an imperial title. I don't know if you catch what just happened. In a single sentence of 9 words, without naming anyone, without raising his voice, that man has just transferred 2 of Caesar's titles to a group of barefoot peasants. If this sounds political to you, it's because it is. And if it makes you uncomfortable that it is, welcome to the club, because that discomfort is exactly the engine that is going to produce, centuries later, the most ingenious theologies ever written to make sure this sermon does not mean what it appears to mean. And then, after the Beatitudes, comes the part you already know by heart. You are the salt of the earth. You are the light of the world. And this is always preached in the key of be a good influence. Smile, be kind, let it show that you're a Christian. Look at the whole verse. Matthew 5:13, you are the salt of the earth, but if the salt loses its taste, how shall it be made salty again? It is no longer good for anything, except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot by men. Thrown out, trampled, that's not a compliment, it's a warning with a threat stuck on the back of it. And there's a technical question people always ask, and that deserves an honest answer. Salt, pure sodium chloride, chemically cannot lose its flavor. It's a stable compound. So what is he talking about? The most reasonable answer is that the salt a Galilean peasant used was not refined table salt. It was salt collected from deposits of the Dead Sea and from salt flats, mixed with gypsum, sand, and other minerals. That material degraded, it washed out with humidity, and what was left was a white powder that no longer salted anything. And that residue was indeed thrown out onto the roads. There are people who go further and tell you very detailed stories about blocks of salt used in dung ovens as a catalyst, and about how they were thrown onto the road when they were spent. It's an explanation that circulates a great deal. I mention it to you because you're going to run into it, but I'll tell you frankly that it rests on thinner evidence than its defenders admit. Stay with what's solid. Impure salt spoils, and spoiled salt gets trampled. And now I want you to do an uncomfortable exercise with me, and we're going to do this several times today. Imagine that tomorrow morning, in your city, in your neighborhood, a man appears. He brings no credentials. He has no channel. He has no church. He sits down on a bench in the square and starts talking. And the first thing he says is that those who are doing well in this life have already collected their reward, that those who laugh are going to weep, and that the people you like and whom everyone speaks well of are, in fact, in trouble. How long would you take to cross to the other side of the street? Be honest, because that crowd in Galilee did not leave. They stayed for 3 whole chapters, and at the end, Matthew says, they were astounded. We can't even get through the first verse without sticking an "in spirit" on the end of it. And everything we've covered so far, all of it, the Beatitudes, the salt, the light, is still the warm-up. Because in verse 21, the Master is going to do something no rabbi of his time dared to do, something that technically placed him above Moses, and he's going to do it 6 times in a row. And of those 6 times, 2 contain errors that you were probably taught in church and that I can demonstrate to you with the text in hand are false. Before the 6, the Master puts on a lock. Matthew 5:17. Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish but to fulfill, and in case anyone missed it, he reinforces it. For truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not an iota, not a dot, will pass from the law until all is accomplished. The iota is the yod, the smallest letter of the Hebrew alphabet, a little mark the size of a comma. The dot, charaia in Greek, is literally a little horn, that tiny stroke that distinguishes one Hebrew letter from another similar one. Jesus has just said that not the most insignificant stroke of the law is going to fall. And then, 20 seconds later, he starts saying, "But I say to you," 6 times. And there you have one of the most difficult and least resolved problems in the entire New Testament. If he didn't come to abolish anything, not a comma, what exactly is he doing when he corrects the law 6 times in a row? The specialists have been at this for centuries and haven't reached agreement. I'm going to give you the 3 main exits, and I'm going to tell you which seems strongest to me and why, but I want you to know that none of them closes the matter entirely. The first reading says that the Nazarene doesn't correct the law, but intensifies it. The law said, "Do not kill," and he says, "Don't even hate." The law said, "Do not commit adultery," and he says, "Don't even look like that." He's not taking anything away. He's tightening the screw all the way down. The verb he uses, pleru, to fulfill, can mean to bring something to its fullness, to its maximum expression, to squeeze all the juice out of it. Under this reading, the words on the hillside are Jewish law taken to the extreme, and Jesus is doing what the rabbis did, interpreting the Torah, only more radically than any of them. The second reading says yes, he is revoking, that when he says, "But I say to you," on the subject of divorce and on the subject of eye for an eye, he's cancelling permissions that the law of Moses itself granted, and that calling that not abolishing is a play on words. And the third reading says that the Master doesn't touch the law at all. What he corrects is how it was being taught. And there's a detail in the text that almost nobody points out to you because it changes things quite a bit. When Jesus quotes the scriptures anywhere else in the Gospels, he uses a fixed formula. It is written, gegraptai. It's the technical formula for citing the sacred text. He uses it against the devil in the wilderness 3 times in a row. It is written, it is written, it is written. Here he doesn't say that. Here he says, you have heard that it was said. Ekusate hoti erethe. You have heard, not you have read, not it is written. It's a different formula, and it points to what people had heard, to the teaching received, to the oral tradition that wrapped around the commandment, not necessarily to the commandment itself. Does that close the problem? No, and I'm not going to lie to you and say it does, because in some of the 6, what follows, you have heard that it was said, is a literal and exact quotation of the biblical text, and there, the exit gets considerably complicated. But it's a real clue. It's in the Greek, and it explains much better than the other 2 why the man who said not an iota could say but I say to you without feeling that he was contradicting himself. Let's go to the 6 and pay close attention, because in the 5th and the 6th something is waiting for you that's probably going to hurt. The first, you have heard that it was said to the ancients, you shall not murder. But I say to you that anyone who is angry with his brother shall be liable to judgment. And then it escalates. Whoever calls his brother Racha shall be liable to the council, and whoever calls him a fool shall be liable to the hell of fire. Racha is an Aramaic word that Matthew didn't even bother to translate, and it means something like empty, hollow airhead. It's a schoolyard insult. And the Nazarene has just put it in the same sentence as homicide. Is it literal? Do you really believe that insulting someone sends you to the same tribunal as a murderer? There it is again. You've already started to negotiate. And the word we translate as hell, by the way, is Gehenna. And it's not an abstract concept. It's a physical place. The Valley of Hinnom, south of Jerusalem. A real ravine that had an atrocious history, because according to 2 Kings 23:10, children had been sacrificed there in the fire, and King Josiah had to defile the site so that no one would ever do it again. When Jesus says Gehenna, his listeners don't imagine a theological idea. They see a cursed ravine that's a half-hour's walk from the city. Now, about that valley, there circulates a story you'll hear in 1,000 sermons. That in the time of the Christ, it was the burning garbage dump of Jerusalem, with permanent fires and worms. It's a beautiful image, and it fits the text perfectly. And I'm going to be honest with you, there is no archaeological or ancient literary evidence that the valley functioned as a burning dump in the 1st century. That idea appears for the first time, as far as it can be traced, in a rabbinic commentary from the 13th century, by the Rabbi David Kimhi, 13 centuries later. It may have been true and left no record, but when someone tells it to you as an archaeological fact, they're telling you a medieval tradition dressed up as science. And on this channel, we don't do that, not even when the story favors us. The second antithesis. You have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you that anyone who looks at a woman to lust after her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. And then, immediately, come the eye and the hand. If your right eye causes you to stumble, tear it out and throw it away. And if your right hand causes you to stumble, cut it off and throw it away. Here we are, at the verse we opened the video with. And I want us to look together, calmly, at how the machinery of evasion works, because it's fascinating. Nobody does this. And nobody has done it from the beginning. The primitive church did not produce generations of one-eyed, one-handed believers. The great ancient interpreters, Augustine, John Chrysostom, Jerome, all read this as a figure, and they had solid textual reasons. In Semitic culture, hyperbole was a standard rhetorical tool, and Jesus himself uses it constantly. A camel through the eye of a needle. A log in the eye, straining out a gnat and swallowing a camel. It's his usual register. It's how he talks. There's a famous story, which you've probably heard, about Origen of Alexandria. the great Christian scholar of the 3rd century, who supposedly castrated himself for taking a similar text literally. Eusebius of Caesarea tells it in his ecclesiastical history. And here too, I have to hit the brakes and tell you the truth. Many modern historians seriously doubt that story. Eusebius writes almost a century later he had his own motives, and Origen himself in his writings explicitly mocks those who read that kind of text literally. It's perfectly possible that the anecdote is slander. But notice why the story has survived so many centuries. It survives because we need the madman. We need there to exist a guy, one single one, a fanatic who took it at face value and ended up mutilated, so that we can point at him and say, see, that's what happens when someone obeys this literally. And once we have the madman, all the rest of us are at ease. It's a beautiful psychological operation, and you're going to see it working on an industrial scale when we get to the Anabaptists. The 3rd antithesis, divorce. And there's no way to be gentle about this, so I'm going to go straight in. Matthew 5:32, I say to you that whoever divorces his wife, except on the ground of sexual immorality, makes her commit adultery, except on the ground of sexual immorality. The Greek word is porneia, and it's broad. It covers sexual infidelity and probably something more. That's the exception, the famous exception clause of Matthew. Now open Mark, chapter 10, verses 11 and 12. Whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery against her, and if she divorces her husband and marries another, she commits adultery. No exception. Open Luke, chapter 16, verse 18. Everyone who divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery. No exception. Mark doesn't have the clause, Luke doesn't have the clause, and Paul, in 1 Corinthians 7, introduces a different exception, that of the unbelieving spouse who leaves, which means you have 3 formulations and 3 different treatments of the same matter within the same New Testament. What do we do with that? There are several serious answers. That Matthew writes for a Jewish community and makes explicit something that in that context was taken for granted. That Mark compresses. That the clause is a later pastoral adaptation. That porneia refers to illegal incestuous marriages under Jewish law and not to adultery in general, a reading that has respectable defenders. What you cannot do, if you're going to be honest, is pretend that the 3 texts say the same thing. They don't. And on that difference, entire centuries of Christian marriage policy have been built. Marriages have been annulled, sacraments have been denied, churches have been broken. I don't have the answer, but I'd 1,000 times rather tell you there's a real problem here than sell you a cheap harmonization that doesn't survive 5 minutes of examination. The 4th antithesis, oaths. Again, do not swear at all, neither by heaven, nor by earth, nor by Jerusalem, nor by your head. Let your speech be yes, yes, no, no. And this one I want you to mark it mentally because it's going to come back. Because for 1,500 years, European Christendom swore. It swore in the courts, it swore loyalty to the king, it swore in contracts, it swore on the very Bible that contains the verse forbidding swearing. And nobody saw any contradiction because the theologians had built very carefully the explanation of why this didn't apply. And then, in the 16th century, a group of people appeared who decided to take it seriously. And they drowned them. We'll come back to them, I promise you. Now, if you're getting this far, I want to ask you for something concrete. Subscribe to the channel now, because what's coming from this point on is the part that cost me weeks of verification, and it's where you're going to discover that 2 of the things you probably believe about this sermon, things that are preached from the pulpit every Sunday, are simply false. And one of them, I have to tell you, I said myself, fifth antithesis. You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye, and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist the one who is evil. Now tell me how they explained this to you. They explained it like this, didn't they? That the Old Testament was a brutal era of vengeance, of savage justice, where if they took out your eye, you went and took out the other guy's eye. And that then the rabbi from Galilee arrived with the gospel of love and put an end to that barbarism. It's a beautiful story. And it's false. Let's go to the text. The phrase appears 3 times in the law of Moses. Exodus 21, verse 24. Leviticus 24, verse 20. Deuteronomy 19, verse 21. Jurists call it the lex talionis, the law of retaliation. And what does the law of retaliation actually do? It puts a ceiling. Before the talion and in the cultures that surrounded it, vengeance had no limit. You take out my eye, I kill your son. You wound my cousin, I burn your village. The blood escalated, and a small offense turned into a war between clans. You have it portrayed in the Bible itself, in the mouth of Lamech, in Genesis 4:24. If Cain is avenged 7-fold, then Lamech 77-fold. That was the previous logic. Vengeance multiplied. And then the law says, an eye for an eye. That is, one eye. Only one eye, not 2, not the life, not the family. The reparation cannot be greater than the damage. The talion is not a license for vengeance, it's a leash. It's one of the most important legal innovations of antiquity, and its function is exactly the opposite of the one they told you. It exists to stop the escalation, not to permit it. And there's more, and this finishes off the myth completely. In Second Temple Judaism, in the era in which Jesus is speaking, the law of retaliation was no longer applied physically in ordinary legal practice. It had become a system of economic compensation. It's recorded with total clarity in the Mishnah, in the tractate Bava Kama, chapter 8, first part, where it's established how damage done to a person is valued. You calculate the injury, the pain, the medical treatment, the lost work time, and the humiliation suffered, and it's paid. With money, not with eyes. Now let's be rigorous, because the Mishnah is compiled around the year 200, more than a century and a half after the Messiah, and you can always argue about how much of that principle was already operating in his time. But the rabbinic debate the Mishnah records doesn't appear out of nowhere, and there are solid indications that monetary commutation was the normal practice much earlier. What I want you to see is this. When Jesus said, "You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye," his audience was not composed of savages walking around Galilee, tearing each other's eyes out. It was composed of Jews who knew perfectly well that this meant a proportional and regulated indemnity. So the man on the rock is not correcting a barbarism, he's doing something much more radical. He's saying that not even just measured, proportional, legal reparation is what his disciples should seek. He's not saying don't go too far. He's saying renounce the right the law grants you, and that is infinitely harder to swallow. Because against savage vengeance, it's easy to preach. Who defends savage vengeance? Nobody. But against your legitimate right to be compensated for a harm done to you, that's another thing entirely. That touches you today, in the lawsuit you have pending, in the money you're owed, in the apology you deserved and never got. And that's why we soften it. That's why we prefer the version in which Jesus came to correct a bunch of barbarians. Because in that version, the ones being corrected are them. In the real version, the one being corrected is you. And in case any doubt remained, the Master doesn't stop there. After "do not resist the one who is evil," he unloads 3 concrete examples, one after another, and all 3 are much worse than they look in translation. The first, "To the one who wants to sue you and take your tunic, let him have your cloak as well." And there's a bomb hidden in the vocabulary. In Greek, there are two garments and two words. The chiton is the tunic, the inner garment, the one you wear against your body. The himation is the mantle, the cloak, the outer garment, the coat. And for a poor Galilean peasant, those two garments were, basically, everything he had on. Now open the law of Moses. Exodus 22, verses 26 and 27. If you take your neighbor's cloak in pledge, you shall return it to him before the sun goes down. For that is his only covering. It is his garment for his body. In what shall he sleep? And Deuteronomy 24 says the same, which means Jewish law specifically protected the cloak. A creditor could take it as security during the day, but he had to give it back to you at nightfall because it was your blanket. It was the only thing a poor man had to sleep with. The cloak was legally unseizable. And Jesus says, give it to him. Think about the scene he has just described. You're in a court. Someone is suing you over a debt and has taken your tunic, the clothing you wear underneath. And the Nazarene tells you to hand over as well the one thing the law guaranteed you could keep. If you give him both garments, you walk out of the courthouse naked. And this is not a metaphor. It's literally what the text describes. This is where the reading of Walter Wink comes back, whom we'll mention later on, because he proposes that in Jewish culture, nakedness shamed above all the one who looked, not the one who was naked. And he cites the episode of Noah in Genesis 9, where the sin belongs to the sons who see, not to the father who is naked. Under that reading, the debtor who walks out of the court naked is exposing the entire system that stripped him. It's brilliant. And I already told you it's a proposal, not a fact. And I'll say it again. What is a fact is the scandal of the text. Jesus is telling you to renounce the legal protection the Torah itself grants you. Second example. And this one is the one almost nobody explains well. Whoever forces you to carry a load for 1 mile, go with him 2. Sounds like advice about kindness, doesn't it? Be generous, make an extra effort, the extra mile, give more than they ask you for. There are business management books with that title. Now the Greek. The verb is angareo, and it doesn't mean to ask a favor. It means to requisition. It's a technical term of imperial law. The angareia was the legal right that Roman soldiers and officials had to compel a civilian of an occupied province to carry their baggage or their load for a determined distance. They didn't ask you. They didn't thank you. They ordered you. A Roman soldier would cross your path on the road, put his pack on your back, and you walked. And you couldn't refuse, because refusing was defying the empire. It's humiliation in the shape of a law. And the master tells an occupied people who really suffered that, on the dirt road in front of their children, that when the soldier who is humiliating them finishes his mile, they should keep walking another one, voluntarily. And why? Because in the second mile, everything inverts. In the first, you're a beast of burden under compulsion. In the second, you're a free man who decides. The soldier is no longer in command. You are giving. And there's a final detail about that word that raises the hair on my arms. That verb, angaruo, appears in the Gospel of Matthew one more single time, Matthew 27, verse 32. As they went out, they found a man of Cyrene named Simon. This man they compelled to carry the cross. They compelled. Engariusan. It's exactly the same word. Simon of Cyrene was a victim of the angaria. A Roman soldier pulled him out of the crowd, threw the beam of a condemned man onto him, and made him walk. Which means the same verb Jesus used on the hillside when he said, "Go with him 2 miles," is the verb Matthew uses when they load the cross onto a stranger on the road to Golgotha. And that stranger walked that mile behind the Nazarene. I don't know if Matthew did it on purpose. Nobody can know. But it's there in the Greek, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. Third example, and this one is the most ignored in the entire New Testament. Give to the one who asks you, and do not refuse the one who wants to borrow from you. Read it again, because it has no clauses. It doesn't say, to the one who asks you, evaluate whether he really needs it. It doesn't say, don't give money to an addict. It doesn't say, teach him to fish instead of giving him the fish. It doesn't say, make sure he isn't manipulating you. It says, to the one who asks you, give. And in 2,000 years, all of Christianity, in all its branches, with all its finance ministries, with all its stewardship seminars, with all its books on the wise administration of resources, has managed not to obey that verse a single time without first attaching 3 conditions to it. I don't obey it either. Let that be stated. Only I'm not going to pretend the text says something else. 6th antithesis. And this is the one that cost me the most to verify, and the one that surprised me most. Matthew 5:43. You have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. You shall love your neighbor. That's in the Bible. Leviticus 19 verse 18. You shall love your neighbor as yourself and hate your enemy. Go look for it. Go ahead. Take your Bible and look for the Old Testament verse that commands hating the enemy. It doesn't exist. It's not in Leviticus, it's not in Deuteronomy, it's not in Exodus, it's not in the Psalms as a commandment, it's nowhere in the Hebrew law. No Old Testament text orders hating the enemy. And not only does it not order it, the law commands the opposite in several places. Exodus 23 verse 4. If you find your enemy's ox wandering, you shall bring it back to him. Proverbs 25 verse 21. If your enemy is hungry, give him bread to eat. That verse, by the way, is the one Paul quotes in Romans 12. So what is Jesus quoting? He's quoting what people had heard. Remember the formula. You have heard that it was said. He didn't say it is written. He's quoting an attitude, a common teaching, a popular drift, a conclusion people had drawn on their own. If God commands me to love my neighbor, then whoever is not my neighbor is left outside. And if he's outside, I can hate him. It's the most human logic in the world, and nobody needs to write it on a tablet of stone. It writes itself in the heart, every day. But there's one more clue, and it's one of the most fascinating things that 20th century archaeology gave to the study of this sermon. In 1947, in some caves in the Judean desert, beside the Dead Sea, some Bedouins found some scrolls. Among them was a document we know today as the Community Rule, the manual of the sect that lived at Qumran, contemporary with the Christ. And in the first column of that scroll, in lines 9 and 10, appears the instruction to love all the sons of light and hate all the sons of darkness. There it is, written in Hebrew, in the 1st century before Christ, by a real Jewish group. Now careful, and this is important so you don't accuse me of selling smoke. I am not telling you that Jesus was quoting the Qumran scroll. Almost certainly he wasn't, and most specialists don't hold that. The Essenes were a minority group, isolated, and there's no evidence their texts circulated among Galilean peasants. What I'm telling you is something else, and it's more interesting. I'm telling you that that way of thinking existed, that there were pious, devout Jews, zealous for the law, who did in fact conclude that loving your neighbor implied hating the outsider. The phrase the rabbi from Galilee quotes didn't come out of nowhere. It was in the air. And now we have a scroll that proves it. That discovery is a gift, and yet you almost never hear it in a sermon, because telling this requires first admitting that the verse Jesus quotes is not in the Bible, and admitting that is uncomfortable. Now we're going to turn up the temperature a bit, because what's coming is about me too. Matthew 6, the middle chapter, and the Messiah changes the subject. He stops talking about how you treat others and starts talking about how you do your religion, and he dismantles 3 things: almsgiving, prayer, and fasting. The 3 pillars of Jewish piety. And in all 3 he says exactly the same thing: do it in secret. And in all 3 he uses the same word for those who don't do it in secret: hypocrites. And in Greek, that word was not originally a moral insult. It was a job. It meant actor, the one who answers from behind the mask, the one who plays a role in the theater. And about 4 miles from Nazareth, there was a city called Sepphoris, the administrative capital of Galilee. And in Sepphoris, there's an excavated Roman theater with capacity for thousands of spectators. And this is where I have to rein in the horse, because this fact is always told in a way that goes beyond what can be proven. You're going to hear that Jesus, as a child, watched plays in Sepphoris, and that's why he used the word actor. It's a charming image. The problem is that the dating of the theatre of Sepphoris is disputed among archaeologists, and there are specialists who place it later, possibly in the 2nd century. It may be that in the childhood of the man on the rock, that theatre didn't yet exist. So let's stay with what is solid, which is already plenty. The word Hippocrates meant actor, and Jesus chose to call the people who prayed to be seen actors. That doesn't need any theatre to work. And now, prayer. Matthew 6:9. Pray then like this: Our Father who art in heaven. And we arrive at the point where I have to do something that isn't comfortable, and that's to correct myself in front of you. There's a claim about the Lord's Prayer that gets repeated absolutely everywhere. It's one of the jewels of modern Christian preaching, and it's this, that the Aramaic word Abba, which the Master used to address God, was the babble of a small child. That it meant, literally, daddy, papa. That it was infant language, intimate, tender, and that no Jew would ever have dared to speak that way to the Almighty, and that this is why Jesus' intimacy with the Father was absolutely unprecedented. I have said that on this channel, and I was wrong. That thesis has a specific father and a specific name. It was popularized by the German scholar Joachim Jeremias, one of the great specialists of the 20th century, in his works on the words of the Nazarene. And for decades, it became pulpit consensus in half the world. And then came James Barr. Barr was a first-rate Semitic philologist, and in 1988, he published in the Journal of Theological Studies an article whose title says it all: Abba isn't daddy, and he demonstrated it with the full apparatus. Abba in Aramaic was not exclusively childish language. It was the normal, everyday form an adult used to refer to his father. Adult children called their father Abba. The word appears in legal and formal contexts. A small child might use it, yes, just as an English-speaking child says dad, but a 50-year-old man used it too, and that doesn't make it a babble. The correct equivalent is not daddy, it's father. Simply father in the everyday and familiar register, not in the protocol register. And today, almost 40 years later, Barr's critique is widely accepted among New Testament specialists. Jeremias himself, in his later works, had already considerably qualified his original formulation. Does this mean Jesus' prayer wasn't intimate? No, not at all. Calling God Father in the direct and confident way he does it, and teaching his disciples to do it, is still remarkable. The intimacy is there, in the text, and it doesn't need to be exaggerated. The only thing that dies is the exaggeration. And you'll wonder why I take the trouble to come here and dismantle something I myself said, something that was hurting nobody, something that also sounded lovely in the video. I'll tell you without decoration. Because if I lie to you about the small thing, you have no reason to believe me about the big thing. And because building faith on false data is exactly the same as building a house on sand, and that, as it happens, is the ending of this sermon. Let's keep going. Because in the same chapter there's another error, and this one is even more common. Matthew 6:22. The lamp of the body is the eye. So if your eye is good, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eye is evil, your whole body will be in darkness. And this is preached as if it were a mystical text about contemplation. Watch what you look at. What comes in through your eyes fills your soul. Don't watch impure things. It's good advice. It's not what the text says. Look at where that verse is placed. Read what comes right before and right after, because the context resolves it on its own. Right before, verses 19 to 21. Do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth, but lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Right after verse 24, you cannot serve God and money, mammon, which means the verse about the eye is stuck in a sandwich and both slices of the sandwich are money. And it's no coincidence because good eye and evil eye were Hebrew idioms with a technical and perfectly documented meaning. Proverbs 22 verse 9, he who has a bountiful eye will be blessed, for he gives of his bread to the poor. The good eye is the generous one. It's right there, explained in the verse itself. Proverbs 28 verse 22. A man with an evil eye hastens after riches. The evil eye is the miser. Also explained, Deuteronomy 15 verse 9. Speaking of the year of the remission of debts, beware lest your eye be evil against your needy brother and you give him nothing. Again, evil eye equals stinginess. The master is not talking about pornography. He is not talking about what you see on a screen. He is talking about your wallet. He's saying that greed leaves you dark on the inside, and he's saying it in the middle of an entire block about money, using an idiom that any Jew understood without needing an explanation. And we have spiritualized this so thoroughly, with such conviction, for so long, that today practically nobody preaches that verse on what it's actually about. And why? Think about it yourself. A sermon about watching what you look at costs nobody anything. A sermon about your greed leaving your soul in the dark empties the offering plate. And since we're in the block about money, let's stay here because this is the piece of the sermon that has been most domesticated, and I want you to see how it was done. Matthew 6:24. No one can serve two masters. You cannot serve God and money. The word we translate there as money is mammonas, mammon. And probably if I say mammon to you, you see a demon, a dark figure, a prince of hell, the lord of greed, with horns, perhaps. That is not in the Bible. Mammon in Aramaic is simply the word for money, for goods, for property, for that thing you have in the bank. Some linguists relate it to a root having to do with that in which one trusts, which, if correct, would be almost too perfect. Nevertheless, it's not a demon, it's not an entity, it's not a fallen angel. The transformation of Mammon into a demon with a proper name happened afterward. It consolidated in medieval theology and literature, and it was fixed forever in the Western imagination when John Milton, in Paradise Lost, in 1667, put him among the fallen angels in the council of hell, which means once again we have the same thing, a later literary tradition that installs itself in your head as if it were biblical text. And what do you lose when you turn Mammon into a demon? You lose everything. Because a demon is something external. A demon is an enemy to be resisted, a dark power to pray against. And when money is a demon, the solution is spiritual. Rebuke, bind, declare. Only if Mammon is simply money, your money, the money in your account right now, then Jesus has just said that there's a perfectly normal, legal and respectable thing in your life that competes with God for the throne, and that you can't have both. A demon is cast out. An idol has to be let go of, and letting go is infinitely more expensive. And from there, the sermon enters its most famous and worst understood block. Therefore I tell you, do not be anxious about your life, what you will eat or what you will drink, nor about your body, what you will wear. Look at the birds of the air, that they neither sow nor reap nor gather into barns. Notice the precision of that phrase, because it's surgical. It doesn't say the birds don't work. Birds work enormously hard. A bird spends the entire day looking for food, and if it stops looking, it dies. Any Galilean peasant knew that perfectly well, and the Nazarene wasn't telling anyone to lie around. He says 3 concrete things. They don't sow, they don't reap, they don't gather into barns. That is, they don't do agriculture, they don't plan next year's harvest. And above all, they don't store. The barn is what's in the crosshairs, the accumulation. The bird eats today, and tomorrow it goes out to look again. And then come the lilies. Consider the lilies of the field, how they grow. They neither toil nor spin. Yet I tell you that not even Solomon in all his glory was arrayed like one of these. And here's a small note of botany, because the image improves enormously when you see it properly. What we translate as lily is krinon in Greek, and the word was used fairly broadly for showy wildflowers. Most specialists think Jesus was pointing at the flowers that in fact cover the hillsides of Galilee in spring. And above all, the anemone, a flower of an intense, almost scandalous red that in March and April carpets those hills with color. Not a white florist's lily, a wild red mantle, free, that grows on its own and that costs nobody anything. And Solomon, the richest king in the history of Israel, with his gold of Ophir and his fabrics dyed with the purple of Tyre, the most expensive in the ancient world, didn't come remotely close. And in the middle of all that, in verse 27, there's a sentence, I'll bet you anything you were taught wrong. And which of you, by being anxious, can add 1 cubit to his stature? A cubit is about 18 inches. And adding 18 inches of height is not a worry anybody has. And there's the translation problem. The Greek word is helikia, and it has 2 possible senses. It can mean stature, the height of your body, and it can mean age, the stretch of life you have left. If it's stature, the sentence is a deliberately absurd hyperbole. Nobody stretches 1.5 feet by worrying. If it's age, the sentence is something completely different and much more piercing. Which of you, however much you agonize, can add a stretch to your life? And there are respectable translations that go each of the 2 ways. There's no consensus. And again, I tell you the same thing. I'd rather tell you there's an open discussion than pick the version that sounds better for you and sell you that as if it were what the original says. And we arrive at the verse that sustains, all by itself, an entire industry. Matthew 6:33. Seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be added to you. All these things. And on those 4 words, one of the most profitable theologies of the last century has been built. Seek God first, and God will give you everything else. The house, the car, the promotion, the bank account, the financial miracle. Now go back 2 verses and look with your own eyes at what all these things refers to. Verse 31. Do not be anxious then, saying, what shall we eat, or what shall we drink, or what shall we wear? Food, drink, clothing, that's it. That's the complete list. All these things are 3. And they're the 3 things without which a human being dies. The Christ is speaking to people who really might not eat tomorrow, and he is promising them exactly that they are going to eat, drink, and be clothed. He is not promising them prosperity. He is promising them subsistence. Turning that promise of bread into a promise of wealth is not a translation error. It's a robbery. And the chapters finish, verse 34. So do not be anxious about tomorrow, for tomorrow will be anxious for itself. Sufficient for the day is its own trouble, and this is the final domestication, and it's the subtlest of all. We have turned this entire block into a therapeutic message. Don't worry. Breathe. Rest in God. Relax, everything's going to be fine. It's on the coffee mugs and on the t-shirts. And yes, there's comfort there, and it's real. And it has saved a lot of people whole nights of anguish. Even so, notice what we've done. We kept the don't worry, and we also kept the barns. Jesus attacked the barns. We removed the part that cost money, we held on to the part that gives peace, and we call that preaching these 3 pages. And we still haven't gotten to the great escapes. These are the small ones. These are the ones that slip in through a translation, a badly prepared sermon, a phrase repeated without verification. The great escapes are another thing. The great ones were signed by the best theologians in history. They're written in books that are still studied, and they work so well that they've been operating for centuries without anyone noticing. Nevertheless, before we go there, I owe you 3 more. And one of the 3 has to do with the most quoted phrase in the Bible by people who don't believe in the Bible. Judge not, that you be not judged. Matthew 7:1. Probably the most quoted biblical verse on the planet by people who have never opened a Bible in their lives. It's the card that gets played the moment anyone points anything out. It's the universal shield. You can't say anything. The Bible says, judge not. And now keep reading. Only 5 more verses. Matthew 7:6. Do not give what is holy to dogs, nor cast your pearls before swine. In order not to give what is holy to dogs, you have to be capable of identifying a dog. That's a judgment. Keep going. Matthew 7:15. Beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravenous wolves. By their fruits you shall know them. In order to beware of a false prophet, you have to evaluate a prophet and conclude that he's false. That's a judgment, and moreover it's a judgment about a concrete person who presents himself as good. Which means that in the same chapter, a few lines apart, the same teacher tells you not to judge, and then orders you to discriminate between dogs and non-dogs, between wolves and sheep, between good fruit and bad fruit. Is he contradicting himself? No, he never contradicted himself. What happened is that we tore verse 1 out of its paragraph and turned it into a slogan. Read the whole paragraph. Matthew 7:3-5. Why do you look at the speck that is in your brother's eye, and do not notice the log that is in your own eye? First, take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye. Notice the ending. And then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye. The text does not say, leave the speck alone. It says first take out the log and then go after the speck. The goal was never to eliminate judgment. It was to eliminate hypocrisy in judgment. And the words besides are a carpenter's. Karphos is a splinter, a wisp, a mote. Dokos is a beam, a roof timber. The man speaking worked with wood, and he chose to make his audience laugh. The image of a guy with a roof beam sticking out of his face, trying to remove a splinter from someone else's. It's humor, it's workshop humor, and we have turned it into the universal excuse for never telling anyone the truth. Let's go to the next one, and this one hurts Christian pride. Matthew 7:12. Whatever you wish that others would do to you, do also to them. The golden rule. And it's always preached as if it were an absolute invention of the rabbi from Galilee, as if nobody in all of human history had had that idea before. That's not true, and it has to be said. In the Babylonian Talmud, in the Tractate Shabbat, folio 31, a famous story is told. A Gentile approaches the Rabbi Hillel, who lived a generation before Jesus, and asks him to teach him the whole Torah while standing on one foot. And Hillel answers, "What is hateful to you, do not do to your neighbor. That is the whole Torah. The rest is commentary. Go and study it." And there's more. In the book of Tobit, chapter 4, verse 15, which is in the Old Testament of Catholic Bibles and in the Septuagint, the same idea appears in negative form, and similar versions circulate in Greek philosophy, in Confucius, in Indian thought. So no, the idea was not born on that hillside. And yet, look carefully at the difference, because it's real and it's enormous. Hillel says it in the negative, do not do. The Messiah says it in the positive, do. And that is not a grammatical nuance, it's a change of an entire world. The negative version you can fulfill by staying home. If you do nothing to anybody, you've already fulfilled it. You can spend your entire life without harming a single human being, without lifting a finger, without leaving your room, and be in good standing. The positive version doesn't let you stay still. It forces you to ask yourself what you would want done for you, and then to go and do it. The first is a fence. The second is a marching order. That's the contribution. And it's enough. There's no need to inflate it with the lie that nobody had thought of it before. And I have one left, and it's the strangest of all, because it's a word you've probably said hundreds of times without knowing that nobody knows what it means. Give us this day our daily bread. Matthew 6:11. The word we translate as daily is epiousios, and epiousios is a ghost. It appears nowhere else in the New Testament except in the parallel version of this same prayer in Luke. It doesn't appear in the Greek translation of the Old Testament. It practically doesn't appear in all of ancient Greek literature that we preserve. It's one of the most mysterious words in the New Testament, and we've spent 2,000 years without resolving it. Origen, who was Greek, who read Greek the way you read your own language, and who lived in the 3rd century, wrote in his treatise on prayer that the word was not used among the Greeks, that it didn't appear in the authors, and that it seemed to him the evangelists had coined it themselves. If to a native Greek reader of the 3rd century the word already sounded invented, imagine us. And there are 3 main candidates for its meaning, depending on how you break the word down. 1. That which is necessary for existence, the bread I need to subsist, the bread of subsistence. 2. The bread of the coming day, tomorrow's. And there's a precious fact that supports this. Jerome, who translated the Bible into Latin in the 4th century, left it in writing that he had seen a gospel in Hebrew, the so-called Gospel of the Hebrews, and that there the word was mahar, which in Hebrew means tomorrow. Tomorrow's bread give us today. 3. Simply the bread of each day, the daily one. Which is it? We don't know. Seriously, we don't know. And notice what changes depending on which you choose. If it's the bread of subsistence, the prayer is a poor man's plea. Give me today just enough not to die. If it's tomorrow's bread, the prayer has an eschatological edge. Give me today, now, an advance on the bread of the kingdom that is coming. They are different prayers, very different. And that uncertainty, that honest, humbling uncertainty, is at the heart of the most prayed prayer in human history, which, when you think about it, has a perfect irony. The prayer that millions repeat from memory every Sunday contains a word that nobody has managed to translate with certainty in 2 millennia, and nobody notices. Because we're not listening to it, we're reciting it, and that exact phenomenon is what this entire video is about. All right, so much for the small escapes. The translation errors, the verses taken out of context, the inflated theses, the pulpit myths, all of that is leaks. Now let's go to the hole in the hull, because so far I've shown you how the sermon gets misinterpreted. What's coming now is how it gets neutralized. And to understand the neutralization, first you have to see what happens when someone decides not to neutralize it. You have to see the price. You have to see what happens concretely in the real world to a human being who reads these 3 pages and decides, without further ado, to do what they say. And for that, we're going to move 1,500 years forward in time to a Swiss city on the banks of a river in the month of January of 1525. Zurich, January of 1525. The Reformation has been underway for a few years, and in Zurich, a reformer named Ulrich Zwingli is in charge. But there's a group of young men, disciples of his, who have begun to read the New Testament on their own, and have arrived at a conclusion Zwingli finds intolerable. They have concluded that the baptism of babies is not in the New Testament. The city council forbids the discussion, and on the night of January 21st of 1525, in a house in Zurich, a group meets and does something illegal. A man named George Blaurock asks another, Conrad Grebel, to baptize him as an adult. Grebel does it with water from a jug, and with that jug, the Anabaptist movement begins. Now then, If you think these people were persecuted over a technical discussion about the age at which you get a child wet, you understood nothing, and you're not the only one. They killed them for the Sermon on the Mount. 2 years later, in February of 1527, in a village called Schleitheim, the Anabaptists draw up a confession of faith with 7 articles, and 2 of those 7 articles come directly from Matthew 5. The 6th article concerns the sword, and it says, the Christian cannot wield it, not even in the service of the government, not even to defend the innocent. No army, no police, no public office that involves using force. Where does that come from? From do not resist the one who is evil, from love your enemies. The 7th article concerns the oath, and it says, the Christian does not swear. Ever. Not in a court, not before a magistrate, not on the Bible. Where does that come from? From do not swear at all. Let your speech be yes, yes, no, no. And now think for a moment, with a cool head, about what these men have just done. A 16th century state functions on 2 things: the ability to conscript you to fight, and the ability to compel you to swear. The oath is the glue of the entire society. It's how testimony is guaranteed in a trial, how a contract is sealed, how loyalty to the Lord is sworn. Without the oath, there are no courts. Without the sword, there is no army. A community that does not swear and does not fight is not an annoying sect. It's a foreign body inside the organism of the state. That's why they killed them. Catholics and Protestants, together. It was practically the only thing they agreed on in the entire 16th century. And here comes the detail you're not going to be able to forget. Felix Manz, one of the founders of the movement, is captured. On the 5th of January of 1527, the Council of Zurich, the Protestant city, the city of the Reformation, condemns him to death. They take him to the river Limmat. They tie his hands to his knees, pass a stick between his arms and his legs, and throw him into the water. They drowned him. The man who insisted that baptism was by immersion, they killed by immersion. And the sources of the era record that the method was chosen with full awareness of the irony. They gave him the water he wanted. His mother was on the bank, urging him to hold firm. And meanwhile, in the churches of all Europe, Christians who did swear, Christians who did wield the sword, Christians who drowned other Christians in a freezing river, went on reading the same sermon every Sunday and saw not the slightest problem. That's the point. That's the entire point. The sermon protects nobody from anything. It can be read whole every week for an entire lifetime, and you can walk out of church and go drown a man. And there's one more scene from this same tradition that is probably the most perfect illustration of Matthew 5:44 that exists in all of documented history. The year 1569, the Netherlands. An Anabaptist named Dirk Willems is imprisoned, condemned to death, and he escapes. He gets out of the tower, crosses the field, and comes to a frozen pond. The ice is thin. Willems is thin from prison. He barely weighs anything. And he manages to cross at a run. Behind him goes a guard chasing him, and the guard weighs more, and the ice breaks. The man chasing him, the man who is going to send him back to the fire, is sinking into the freezing water behind him. Willems is already safe. All he has to do is keep running. He turns around, he comes back onto the ice, and he pulls him out. The guard's life is saved by the man he was hunting, and then the guard, obeying his superior, arrests him again. Dirk Willems was burned on the 16th of May of 1569. The story is recorded in the Anabaptist Martyrology, the Martyr's Mirror, compiled by Tieleman van Bracht in 1660. And the engraving that accompanies it, added in a later edition, has become the most recognizable image of the entire Mennonite tradition. And I want you to hold that scene in your head for a second, because it isn't a parable. It's not a sermon illustration. It's not a hypothetical example a preacher invented for Sunday. It happened. A man turned around on the ice. Love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. He did it, and it cost him his life. And his descendants are still here. The Mennonites, the Amish, the Hutterites, the Brethren, they all come from that trunk. And 5 centuries later, they still don't swear and still don't take up arms. Which means that when someone tells you that that discourse is impossible to obey, that it's an unrealizable ideal, that nobody could live like that, you have the right to answer something very simple. There have been people living like that since 1525, right now, in Pennsylvania, in Ohio, in Paraguay, in Germany, and they haven't gone extinct. I'm not saying they're right about everything. I'm saying that the sentence, "it's impossible," is empirically false, and that it keeps being repeated because it suits us. And they weren't the only ones. In 17th century England, another group appeared with the same literal mania, the Quakers, and their founder George Fox also refused to swear because of the same verse. And the story then takes a turn that seems extraordinary to me, because the Quakers were thrown in prison by the thousands. A Quaker couldn't testify in a court, because to testify you had to swear, and he didn't swear. He couldn't inherit property, he couldn't defend himself legally, he couldn't trade with guarantees. His literalism left him outside the whole of society, and they endured, decade after decade, prison after prison, until the system gave way. In 1696, the English Parliament passed a law allowing Quakers to make a solemn affirmation instead of an oath, the same legal responsibility without the religious formula. And that principle, the right to affirm instead of swear, exists today in the courts of half the world. If you walk into a courthouse today, in many countries, and you don't want to swear on a Bible, you can promise without one. That is not a historical accident. That is Matthew 5:34, forcing its way through 2 centuries of prison until it changed the law. When someone obeys this seriously, the world moves. And now, the Russian, Leo Tolstoy, the author of War and Peace, one of the greatest novelists who has ever existed, and in his maturity, a man in total crisis, searching desperately for what being alive is for. And he found the Sermon on the Mount, and he read it as nobody had read it in centuries. Without permission to soften it, he became obsessed with a single sentence, Matthew 5:39, "Do not resist evil." And from there he built, with an implacable and fairly terrifying logic, all the rest. If you can't resist evil, you can't go to a court, because the court uses force. You can't be a policeman, you can't be a soldier, you can't swear, you can't participate in a state that stands on violence. And you probably can't even hold private property, because in the end, property is defended by a man with a weapon. He published all that in a book called The Kingdom of God is Within You in 1894. They banned it in Russia. It circulated as contraband. And in 1901, the Russian Orthodox Church excommunicated him. Stop there a second. Let it be perfectly clear what just happened. A Christian church expelled a man from its bosom for insisting too much on obeying the words of Jesus, not for denying them, for taking them seriously. And in South Africa, a young Indian lawyer read that book. His name was Mohandas Gandhi. He wrote to Tolstoy. They corresponded. One of the last letters Tolstoy wrote before dying was to him. Gandhi named one of his communities Tolstoy Farm. And Gandhi said, and this is documented in his writings, that these 3 pages reached him directly, that they went straight to the bottom of him. He wasn't a Christian. He never was. And that text reorganized his life. And from Gandhi's method, decades later, drank a Baptist pastor from Atlanta named Martin Luther King, who studied Indian nonviolence and applied it in Montgomery and in Birmingham and in Selma. Trace the line, trace the whole line, because it's astonishing. A Galilean carpenter says, "On a hillside, do not resist evil. A Russian novelist reads it 1800 years later and believes it. A Hindu reads the Russian and with that gets the British Empire out of India. A black pastor reads the Hindu and with that breaks segregation in the United States. That verse your church probably explained to you should not be taken literally, moved 2 continents in the 20th century. And now a note of honesty, because this is a channel where that matters. There's a phrase of Gandhi's that circulates on the internet in millions of images. I like your Christ. I do not like your Christians. Almost certainly Gandhi never said that. It doesn't appear in his complete works, and nobody has managed to locate the source. It's a modern attribution with no backing. And I tell you this, even though it cuts against me, even though it would fit perfectly in this video, because building a true argument on a false quotation is exactly the kind of thing this video is denouncing. We have one left. And this is the one that's hardest for me to tell. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, German theologian. In 1937, with the Nazis already in power, he publishes a book that in German is called simply Discipleship, and that you probably know as The Cost of Discipleship. And that book is, at bottom, a furious commentary on the message from the Mount. Bonhoeffer coins there a term that has become famous, cheap grace. Grace preached without discipleship, forgiveness without repentance, communion without confession, faith without obedience. Grace as a product given away at the church counter that changes nobody's life. And his best-known sentence has a brutality that still cuts. When Christ calls a man, he bids him come and die. Bonhoeffer wrote that while the German church, in its immense majority, was accommodating itself to the regime, he founded a clandestine seminary. They closed it. They forbade him to teach. They forbade him to publish. And then he did something that breaks this video in half. He joined the conspiracy to kill Hitler, the man who had written the most important book of the 20th century about obeying the Sermon on the Mount, the man who had preached the non-violence of Matthew 5 with an intensity few have reached, ended up linked to a plot to assassinate a head of state. They arrested him in April of 1943. He spent 2 years in prison. And they hanged him at the camp of Flossenburg on the 9th of April of 1945. A few weeks before it all ended. What do we do with that? The specialists still argue about how far Bonhoeffer participated operationally in the plot and how far he was only in the circle of those who knew. I'm not going to resolve it here, and nobody has resolved it yet, except that the underlying question doesn't depend on that detail, and it's this. Either Bonhoeffer in the end could not obey what he had preached, or Bonhoeffer understood that obeying, in that moment and in that place, meant doing something the sermon appears to forbid, and he accepted carrying the guilt of that before God without looking for a theological excuse. He himself wrote, from prison, things that point to the second. He spoke of taking on guilt rather than taking refuge in a comfortable innocence. And that is probably the most honest position one can take before these 3 pages. Not to invent yourself a theology that absolves you, to disobey if you have to, knowing that you're disobeying, with no alibi. Because the problem is not that people disobey that discourse. The problem is that 2,000 years of Christianity devoted themselves to building the alibis, and now we're going to look at them, all 5, one by one, and I warn you, one of them is the one you use. The first escape is called the Counsels of Perfection, and it's the oldest of all. It works like this. You divide the commandments into 2 drawers. In the first drawer, you put the precepts, the obligatory commandments. Do not kill, do not steal, do not commit adultery. Those bind you, me, the baker, the king, everyone. In the second drawer, you put the counsels. And counsels are not orders, they're invitations. They're the way of perfection for those who want to go further. And what goes in the second drawer? Voluntary poverty, renunciation, non-resistance, total detachment. Which is to say, a good part of the words from the hillside. The text that anchors the whole construction is Matthew 19:21, when the rich young man asks what he lacks. And the man on the rock answers, "If you would be perfect, go. Sell what you have and give it to the poor, if you would." There's the lever, "if you would," which means it isn't obligatory, which means there's a basic level of Christianity, and then there's an advanced level, and the advanced level is optional. The idea appears in germ very early. The Didache, a Christian manual that may be from the end of the 1st century, already says something similar. If you can bear the whole yoke of the Lord, you will be perfect. If you cannot, do what you can. And in the Middle Ages, the system is formalized, polished, and turned into architecture. Thomas Aquinas gives it its classic form. The evangelical counsels, poverty, chastity, and obedience are the way of the religious. The monks, the nuns, the orders, they do the sermon. You do what you can. And notice what this operation achieves because it's brilliant. It doesn't deny the sermon. It doesn't soften it. It doesn't say Jesus was exaggerating. It says it's true. All of this is real and it's obligatory for them. And with that, the demand stays intact and you go free. It's as if in an army you decided that orders are strictly obligatory for the elite corps, and for everyone else, they're suggestions. And now, in fairness, because this channel doesn't do caricatures, I have to give you the argument from the other side. And it's stronger than it looks. A Catholic theologian would tell you, and rightly, that the doctrine of the councils is not an excuse, but a realistic recognition that different vocations exist, that not everyone is called to the same thing, that the man who marries and has children cannot live like a hermit, and that this doesn't make him a second-class Christian, and that the Church never said that love of enemy was optional, only that certain radical forms of renunciation are. It's a serious argument, and it deserves respect. And here's the problem. The practical effect, measured across 1,000 years of European history, is hard to argue with. Western Christianity operated for centuries with the perfectly settled idea that the hardest parts of the Master's words were for the people in the monastery, and you were not in the monastery. Second escape. And this one is Luther's, and it's more elegant still. It's called the doctrine of the two kingdoms. Luther looks the problem in the face and states it with an honesty you have to grant him. He says, more or less, if all Christians turn the other cheek, who stops the murderer? If no Christian wields the sword, the world gets eaten by wolves, and the ones who eat it are precisely the ones who don't read the sermon. Renouncing force doesn't protect the innocent. It abandons him. It's a good argument. It is, in fact, the best argument ever made against literalism about the Sermon on the Mount. And anyone who dismisses it as cowardice hasn't understood it. And Luther's solution is to split you in two. You, as a person, as a private Christian, in your own affairs. Turn the other cheek. Forgive. Don't take revenge. Don't sue. The sermon binds you fully. You, in your office, in your post, as a magistrate, as a soldier, as a father protecting his child, as the prince's executioner, use the sword. And not only may you must. Because that is the way God governs the world and protects the weak. Two kingdoms, the kingdom of the right hand, which God governs by the gospel, the kingdom of the left hand, which God governs by law and the sword, and you live in both at once. Luther develops it in writings like On Temporal Authority from 1523, and Whether Soldiers Too Can Be Saved from 1526. And the result, let's be clear, is a machine of astonishing efficiency. A Christian executioner can hang a man on Monday and receive communion on Sunday, and there's no contradiction, none at all, because the one who hanged was the office, and the one who takes communion is the person. The sermon stays intact, and it touches nothing. Now then, is this an escape or is it wisdom? It depends on who you ask, and I'm going to give you both versions because both exist. Those who defend it say that without this distinction, Christianity becomes politically irresponsible, that abandoning public justice to the wicked is not holiness, it's negligence, that a father who does not defend his daughter with force when he could is not obeying Jesus, he's failing as a father. Those who criticize it say it has served for centuries to produce Christians with two consciences, one for church and another for work, one for Sunday and another for the rest of the week. And in 20th century Germany, that criticism became very concrete. There were theologians, Bonhoeffer among them, who accused a deformed use of this doctrine of having helped produce the political quietism that left a good part of the German church looking the other way. I have to be careful here, because historians argue about this, and there are those who defend with arguments that a guilt has been loaded onto Luther that isn't his, and that his doctrine was distorted by others centuries later. I'm not going to give you a verdict on Luther's responsibility. I give you the fact. The doctrine exists, the criticism exists, and the debate is still open. What is not in debate is the effect on the sermon. After the two kingdoms, there is no public situation in which Matthew 5 obliges you to anything. Third escape. And I need you to sit down, because this one is mine. This is the one I have preached. This is the one that convinces me. And today it's my turn to put it on the table with the other four and look at it with the same coldness. It's called, in technical language, the theological use of the law. And in everyday speech, it's called the mirror. It works like this. The message from the mount is impossible, and it's impossible on purpose. And there are two verses that hold this up with a force you can't dismiss. The first, Matthew 5:20. If your righteousness is not greater than that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. Think about what that meant to whoever heard it. The Pharisees were the most scrupulous people in Israel. They tithed even the herbs in the kitchen. They fasted twice a week. They counted the steps they could take on the Sabbath. Nobody, absolutely nobody, was more rigorous than they were. And the Nazarene has just said that if your righteousness doesn't surpass theirs, you don't get in. The second, and it's the capstone of chapter 5, Matthew 5:48. You therefore must be perfect, as your Father in heaven is perfect. Perfect. Like God. The Greek word is teleos, and it doesn't exactly mean flawless, but complete, finished, arrived at its end, mature. But even with that nuance, the bar is still where it is, like your Father. And then the mirror reading says, exactly, precisely, that's the point. Jesus isn't giving you a to-do list. He's putting you in front of a perfect mirror so that you see with total clarity that you can't, that you're finished, that not with all your goodwill, not with all your discipline, not with all your religion, do you reach even the first line. And when at last you break, when at last you stop trying to climb, then, and only then, are you ready to receive grace. The sermon is not a ladder, it's a mirror, and the mirror is no use to you for climbing. It's of use for seeing yourself. And now listen to me carefully, because this is important. It's a powerful reading. It's theologically coherent, it has support in Paul, and it is, in all probability, true in part. And it is also an exit. Because notice the practical effect. If the sermon is impossible by design, then your inability to obey it stops being a problem and becomes the demonstration that it worked. Failing is the objective. Not complying is complying. Do you see the trap? It's perfect. It's the only one of the 5 escapes that turns your disobedience into evidence of your orthodoxy. And it has a problem, a big one that can't be dodged, and it's at the end of the sermon itself. Because the Master does not close these 3 pages by saying, and now that you've seen you can't, surrender and receive grace. He doesn't say that. There isn't a single line that says that. He closes by dividing humanity in 2, and the criterion of the division is a single word, Matthew 7:24. Everyone, therefore, who hears these words of mine and does them, I will compare to a wise man who built his house on the rock. Does them. Poio, to do, to carry out, to execute. And the other one, the fool, the man of the sand, is exactly the one who hears them and does not do them. If the sermon had been designed so that nobody would do it, that final parable makes no sense whatsoever. None. Because in that parable there are people who do it, and Jesus calls them wise, and their houses are still standing. Now, in fairness, a Lutheran would tell you that the doing comes afterward, that it springs from faith and not before it, that the order is grace first and works as fruit. And that's a legitimate answer. Even so, the text, as it stands on the hillside, addressed to that crowd, doesn't make that clarification. It says, hear and do. And I, who have preached the mirror reading, have to acknowledge in front of you that the parable of the two houses doesn't fit entirely comfortably into my own theology. And I'd rather tell you that than pretend I don't see it. Fourth escape. And this one comes from the German Academy, and it's the most devastating of all, because it doesn't free you from the sermon. It annuls it. It's called the interim ethic, and it's born with two names, Johannes Weiss in 1892, and above all, Albert Schweitzer. The same Schweitzer who later went to Africa as a doctor and won the Nobel Peace Prize in his great work on the search for the historical Nazarene, from 1906. The thesis is this: Jesus believed the end of the world was imminent, not in centuries, in months. He was convinced that the kingdom of God was going to break in at any moment and that history was ending. And if you believe that, what kind of ethic do you preach? You preach an emergency ethic. Of course, don't accumulate treasures. What for if this ends in the spring? Of course, don't worry about tomorrow. There's almost no tomorrow. Of course, don't resist evil. God's judgment is about to fall on all the wicked and is going to settle everything in one afternoon. They're the rules of a sinking ship. And on a sinking ship, nobody argues about who gets the big cabin. Schweitzer called that interim ethic, the ethic of the interval, norms for an extremely brief parenthesis between now and the end. And what happens if the end doesn't come? Well, then the ethic doesn't apply, because it was never designed for a world still spinning 2,000 years later. It was designed for weeks, and from there the sermon stops being a command and becomes a historical document. Most beautiful, moving, but dated, a relic of a miscalculation. And this, although it sounds like academic library heresy, filtered downward. It reached the liberal pulpits. It reached the seminaries. And today, when someone tells you that the teachings of the Christ have to be understood in their context, and by that they mean they no longer apply, they are serving, without knowing it, a dish that Schweitzer cooked. Now the criticism, and it's strong. First, this thesis rests on a reconstruction of what Jesus was thinking in his head about the dates. And to that, we have no direct access. It's inference, not data. Second, there are texts that go directly against it. Matthew 24:36. But of that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, but only my Father. That verse is hard to reconcile with a rabbi from Galilee who had the calendar locked in. Third, a good part of 20th century scholarship moved toward another idea, that Jesus was not announcing a purely future and imminent kingdom, but a kingdom that was already breaking in during his own ministry, already here and not yet fully. Under that reading, the ethic of the sermon is not an emergency ethic. It's the normal ethic of a kingdom that has already begun. Which means the fourth escape is a hypothesis, disputed, and not the inevitable conclusion it's sometimes presented as, only it did its job. And its job was this: if the Messiah got the date wrong, you're saved from the order. And we come to the fifth, And the fifth is the most efficient of all because it doesn't argue, it doesn't qualify, it doesn't distinguish. It simply tells you that this text is not for you. Fifth escape. Dispensationalism. It's born in the 19th century with an Irish preacher named John Nelson Darby, and it spreads through the English-speaking world thanks to a book you probably haven't read, but that has shaped what you believe more than you imagine, the Schofield Reference Bible, published in 1909. That Bible carries footnotes, and millions of believers for decades read the sacred text with those notes right underneath, until they stopped distinguishing where Scripture ended and where the commentary began. And the note about the sermon in that tradition said in essence the following: "This sermon is the law of the kingdom. Jesus came to offer Israel an earthly kingdom. Israel rejected it. The kingdom was postponed, and therefore the law of that kingdom does not govern now in the age of the church, which lives under grace. It will govern in the millennium, when the kingdom is established," which means the Sermon on the Mount is a legal text for another era and another people. It's magnificent. In a single footnote, 3 whole chapters get filed away. It doesn't tell you the sermon is false. It doesn't tell you it's too hard. It doesn't tell you it's impossible. It tells you something much cleaner. It isn't yours. And I have to make, again, the honesty stop, because this is easy to caricature and it would be unfair. Dispensationalism today is not what it was in 1909. It has changed a great deal. Many 20th century dispensationalists were deeply uncomfortable with that note and qualified it or abandoned it. There's a whole current so-called progressive dispensationalism that explicitly holds that the words from the hillside do bind the Christian of today. And there are serious dispensationalists who would be offended, and rightly, if you told them they believe Matthew 5 doesn't apply to them. So I'm not accusing anyone who identifies with that tradition today. I'm saying that that note existed, that it was printed in millions of Bibles, and that it formed entire generations of preachers in the Anglo-Saxon world and by ricochet in the Hispanic world. And that a good part of the popular Christianity you breathe every day drags that sediment along without knowing where it comes from. And now put them together. The counsels of perfection, it's for the monks. The 2 kingdoms, it's for your private life, not for your office. The mirror, it's impossible on purpose, don't try. The interim ethic, it was for the end of the world, and the world didn't end. Dispensationalism, it's for another era. 5 systems, built by giants, with texts in their favor, with impeccable internal logics, 5 different paths, 5 different eras, 5 different intellectual continents. And all of them, absolutely all of them, end up at exactly the same door. You don't have to do it. And I want you to stop with me a moment, because there's something you only see when you put the 5 in a row. What is the probability that 5 theological traditions, separated by centuries, by languages, by continents, by ferocious enmities, Catholics against Protestants, Germans against English, academics against pastors, all arrive by completely different roads at the same practical conclusion? It's not that they copied each other. They couldn't stand each other. Luther despised the monasteries. The dispensationalists rejected Schweitzer. Schweitzer would have laughed at Schofield. And even so, they all arrived at the same place. When people who hate each other agree on the conclusion, that usually doesn't indicate the conclusion is obvious. It usually indicates that they all wanted to get there. And now let's go to the end of the sermon, because the man on the rock was not stupid, and he knew perfectly well what was going to happen with his words. And pay attention to the order, because the order says everything. He has just given the golden rule. Treat others as you would want to be treated, the most universal phrase, the kindest, the most acceptable, the most adoptable by any religion and any atheist on the planet, the phrase you can embroider on a cushion. And the next thing out of his mouth is this: Matthew 7:13, enter through the narrow gate. For wide is the gate, and broad is the way that leads to destruction, and many are those who enter by it. For narrow is the gate, and hard is the way that leads to life, and few are those who find it. From the cushion to the abyss in a single verse. And that word, hard, deserves your attention. In Greek, it's tethlemene, and it comes from the verb thlibo, which means to press, to compress, to squeeze, to oppress. It's the same root as the word thlipsis, which in the rest of the New Testament is translated as tribulation, which means the hard road is not just narrow in width, it's the pressed road, the road that oppresses you, the road that goes on squeezing you as you advance. And in case you have any hope left that it's the comfortable road, the wide one, the spacious one, the one with a lot of people, that's the other one. And there's one more verb at the end that almost nobody underlines. Few are those who find it, find, discover, heurisco. It doesn't say few are those who enter, it says few are those who find it. And in order to find something, first you have to be looking for it, which means the problem, according to this verse, is not only that the gate is narrow, it's that you have to go looking for it. It isn't on the main road. You don't trip over it. It doesn't show up on its own. And most people, says the text, aren't even looking. And then, immediately afterward, comes the warning, Matthew 7:15. Beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravenous wolves. And now I ask you something, and I want you to think about it seriously. How do you distinguish a wolf in sheep's clothing? Because that's the whole problem, isn't it? If the wolf wore a sign, the warning wouldn't be necessary. The point of the image is that the disguise works. The wolf preaches well. The wolf quotes the scriptures. The wolf has a warm smile and a tidy theology and probably weeps at the right moment in the sermon. So, how? Jesus gives the answer in the next verse, and it's a single line and it's implacable. By their fruits you shall know them. And notice carefully everything that criterion leaves out. It doesn't say, by their doctrine you shall know them. It doesn't say, by their eloquence. It doesn't say, by the size of their congregation. It doesn't say, by their anointing. And above all, pay attention to this. It doesn't say, by their miracles. And that it doesn't say by their miracles is not a deduction of mine. It's guaranteed by what comes 7 verses later, where the ones who are left outside are people who performed miracles and cast out demons. The criterion is the fruit. And what is the fruit? Well, we've spent 3 chapters defining it. The fruit is not hating your brother. It's not looking at a woman as if she were an object. It's keeping your word without needing to swear it. It's not returning the blow. It's loving whoever hates you. It's giving without a trumpet. It's praying in your room and not on the corner. It's not accumulating. It's not judging with a log in your eye. It's giving to the one who asks you. The fruit is doing the sermon, which means the way to detect a false teacher, according to the text itself, is to check whether he lives the 3 pages you've just read. And I need you to see the irony in its full magnitude, because it's one of the biggest things in this video. 2,000 years of theology devoted a colossal intellectual effort to building 5 systems to explain why it isn't necessary to live these 3 pages. And these 3 pages say that the way to know whether a teacher is true or false is to check whether he lives these 3 pages. I'm not calling anyone a false prophet. Let that be crystal clear, because it's not my job and I have no authority for it. Thomas Aquinas was not a wolf. Luther was not a wolf. And I don't have the fruits to go around handing out labels either. I'm only pointing out that the sermon comes with its own detector built in, and that the detector does not measure what you believe or what you know or what you preach. It measures what you do, Matthew 7:21. And brace yourself, because this is probably the most terrifying passage the man on the rock ever pronounced. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, shall enter the kingdom of heaven, but the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. Many will say to me on that day, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and cast out demons in your name, and do many miracles in your name? And then I will declare to them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you workers of lawlessness. Read it again, slowly, and look at who the rejected are. They're not atheists. They're not pagans. They're not idolaters. They're not the ones who never heard of him. They're prophets, they're exorcists, they're workers of miracles, and they did it all in his name. They say so themselves 3 times, in your name, in your name, in your name. These people had a ministry. They had apparent anointing. They had results. If you had seen them in action, you'd have said God was with them, and you'd have had every reason in the world to say it. And the answer they receive is not, you got a doctrinal point wrong. It's not, you fell a little short. It's not almost. It's, I never knew you. Udepote. Never. Not once. Not for an instant. And the Greek we translate as workers of iniquity is literally those who work anomia, the absence of law, those who do not do. And there it is again, the verb that runs through the whole end of the sermon like a hammer. To do. The one who does the will, those who do not do the law, the one who hears and does, the one who hears and does not do. And then, to close, Jesus tells the last parable, and it's the most famous, and it's the one we understand least, because we turned it into a children's song. Everyone who hears these words of mine and does them, I will compare to a wise man who built his house on the rock. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat against that house. And it did not fall, because it was founded on the rock. And everyone who hears these words of mine and does not do them, I will compare to a foolish man who built his house on the sand. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and struck against that house, and it fell. And great was its ruin. Now, 3 things almost nobody tells you about this parable. The first, the 2 houses looked alike. Think about it geographically, because the master is speaking to people who knew that terrain better than their own faces. In Galilee and throughout that region, there are wadis, dry watercourses. In summer, the bottom of a wadi is the most tempting thing in existence to build on. It's flat. It's compacted sand. You don't have to chip away rock. You don't have to dig. It goes up fast. It comes out cheap. And it looks lovely. And the other guy, the wise one, has to look for bedrock. And in Luke chapter 6, verse 48, a detail is added that Matthew doesn't have. He dug, he went deep, and he laid the foundation on the rock. He dug and went deep. That is, he sweated. He lost time. He spent more. He finished later. And when the 2 houses were done, in the middle of the Galilean summer, with the sky blue and not a cloud in sight, a neighbor passing by would not have noticed the slightest difference. 2 houses, identical from the outside. The difference was buried, invisible under the ground. The second thing, the same storm fell on both. Read the text carefully. The rain fell. The floods came, the winds blew and beat against that house. And in the second, the rain fell, the floods came, the winds blew and struck against that house. It's exactly the same sentence. The same rain, the same floods, the same winds. Obeying does not spare you the storm, and this has to be said loudly because there's an entire preaching industry built on the opposite lie. If you do what's right, God delivers you from the tempest. If you have enough faith, the water doesn't reach your door. The text says the opposite. The water reaches both doors with the same force. The wise man gets just as wet. The only thing that changes is that his house is still standing. And the third, and this is the one that caps off this entire video, who is the fool? He's not the one who rejects Jesus. He's not the one who laughs at him. He's not the one who leaves the hillside halfway through the sermon. The fool is the one who hears these words and does not do them, which means the one who stayed, the one who listened to everything. The one who sat on the grass for 3 chapters nodding, moved, admiring, and came down the mountain the same as he went up. That man is the protagonist of the last parable of these 3 pages, and the Nazarene has just described 2,000 years before they existed, all the people who were going to devote their lives to explaining with enormous brilliance why this didn't apply to them. It's the most precise warning ever pronounced, and it was recorded in the very document people would later use in order not to fulfill it. And then Matthew closes, Matthew 7:28. And when Jesus had finished these words, the crowds were astonished at his teaching. And that word, astonished, is too soft. The Greek is ekseplesonto from the verb ekpleso, and it literally means to be struck out of oneself, to be knocked out of yourself. It's the word you'd use for someone who takes an impact and is left disoriented, dazed, not knowing where to put himself. They weren't charmed, they were knocked out. Because he taught them, says the next verse, as one who has authority, exousia, and not as the scribes. The scribes cited, Rabbi so-and-so said, leaning on Rabbi such-and-such, who in turn received it from Rabbi I don't know who, chain of transmission. Nobody spoke on his own. And this man had said 6 times in a row, but I say to you, without a chain, without support, without a footnote, I. And now I have to go back to the beginning, because I owe you an answer, and I'm not going to be able to give it to you whole. We opened this video with the eye and the hand. We said that nobody tears them out, and that we're all right not to because it's hyperbole. And we said that at the exact moment you accept that, the problem opens up for you. Which are hyperbole and which are commandment, and who decides? We've been at this almost 2 hours, and I'm going to tell you the truth. I don't know, and I want you to know that whoever tells you they do know with certainty, without trembling, is selling you their system. It may be a good system, but it's a system, and it carries a man's signature. What I can give you is 3 things that hold up. 3 things that bear the weight. The first is this: hyperbole exists, and recognizing it is not cowardice. Truly, nobody should mutilate himself. That text is a figure, and it was from the first day, and the listeners on the hillside understood it as a figure, and the fathers of the church understood it as a figure, and so do you. That's not an escape. That's reading well. The escape doesn't begin when you recognize a hyperbole. The escape begins when you turn its hyperbole into a master key that opens every door. When you apply it to the eye, and then to the cheek, and then to the enemy, and then to the money, and then to the oath, and suddenly you discover that the whole sermon was poetry, and there isn't a single line left that obliges you to anything. That is no longer exegesis. That's a locksmith at work. The second thing that holds up, and this one is a hard historical fact, is that the 5 escapes arrived late, very late, because when you go to the oldest Christians we preserve, those of the first generations, the ones closest in time to that hillside, you find no trace of those constructions. You find the opposite. Around the year 155, more or less, a Christian philosopher named Justin wrote a defense address to the Roman emperor. It's an extraordinary document because Justin is trying to explain to the most powerful man in the world what exactly these Christians are and why they shouldn't be killed. And what does he do to explain it? He quotes the Sermon on the Mount. He tells the emperor that they don't swear, that they give to whoever asks them, that they love their enemies, that they pray for those who persecute them, that they used to hoard money and now they hold it in common, and he presents it not as a distant ideal, nor as an unreachable goal, nor as a law for the millennium. He presents it as a description of how they live. It's not a theory, it's a report. And there's more. Tertullian in North Africa at the beginning of the 3rd century argues forcefully that a Christian cannot wield the sword, and he uses the text of Jesus to do it. And other writers of the period go the same way. Now, honesty again, because this point is frequently exaggerated and I'm not going to exaggerate it. Historians argue about how widespread Christian rejection of military service was in the first centuries, and there's clear evidence that already in the late 2nd century there were Christians serving in the Roman legions. The primitive church was not a monolithic block of perfect pacifists. And whoever paints it that way for you is painting you a picture, not a map. Even so, the general pattern holds, and it's this. In the first 2 or 3 centuries, when Christians spoke about the sermon, they spoke about it as instructions, not as a mirror, not as counsel for monks, not as a law for another dispensation, not as an emergency ethic for an end of the world that didn't come, as instructions. The systems for not obeying it were built afterward, when the church stopped being persecuted and started to govern, when Christians stopped being the ones who died and started being the ones who signed the sentences. And from that point on, someone had to do the theological work of explaining how a Christian emperor could have an army. That work got done. It got done well, and here we are. And the third thing that holds up is the most uncomfortable of the 3, because it's not an idea, it's a proof. The Master did not close his sermon by giving us a rule of interpretation. He didn't say verses 1 through 20 are literal, and from 21 on they're figurative. He didn't leave us a manual, he left us an exam. And the exam has a single question, and it isn't what you understood, nor what you believed, nor how moved you were, nor what doctrine you defend. The question is what you did. And now, before we finish, I have to complicate your life one last time. Because if you leave with the impression that this video is telling you, do everything literally and that's that, I won't have told you the whole truth, and this channel doesn't exist for that. There's a problem with pure literalism. And the problem is Jesus himself. Go to the Gospel of John, chapter 18. Verse 22. The Nazarene is being interrogated, and one of the guards slaps him. There you have it, the other cheek, the exact moment. The man who said, "If anyone strikes you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also," has just been struck in the face. And what does he do? Verse 23. He answers him, "If I have spoken wrongly, testify about the wrong, but if rightly, why do you strike me?" He does not turn the other cheek. He confronts him. He demands a reason. He asks him to justify the blow, and it's not an isolated case. Paul, in Acts 23:3, on receiving an order that he be struck, tells the high priest that God is going to strike him, "You whitewashed wall." That is not exactly meekness. And in the temple, according to John chapter 2, Jesus made a whip of cords and overturned the tables. So, did the Christ himself disobey his own sermon? No. What's happening is that we're reading the word resist wrong. And there's a very influential reading about this, which you're probably going to run into if you investigate on your own, and I'm going to give it to you with its label on. The American theologian Walter Wink proposed that the slap of Matthew 5:39 is a technical detail. The text specifies the right cheek, and to strike someone on the right cheek with your right hand, which was the only hand used in that culture to touch another person, you have to hit him with the back of it. And the backhand was not a fight. It was the gesture of a superior humiliating an inferior, a master to a slave, a Roman to a Jew. And according to Wink, when you offer the other cheek, the left one, you force him to change the blow. He can no longer hit you with the backhand, he has to hit you with a closed fist. And hitting someone with a closed fist was, in that culture, hitting an equal, which means it isn't submission. It's a move. It's forcing the oppressor to treat you like a person. It's a magnificent reading. And for that very reason, I have to tell you what isn't always said when they tell it to you. It's a proposal. It's disputed. There are specialists who consider it brilliant, and there are specialists who consider it a modern reconstruction that puts on the text an anthropological sophistication the text doesn't claim. It's not an archaeological fact. It's a 20th century interpretation. I find it attractive, and I'm not going to sell it to you as if it were data, because it isn't. What is data? What's in the text without anyone having to reconstruct anything? Is that Jesus before the guard did not return the blow and also did not keep quiet. He spoke, he asked, he confronted, without violence. And that probably is the closest you're going to get to understanding what it means not to resist evil. It isn't being a doormat. It isn't letting people walk all over you. It's refusing to play the other person's game and doing it standing up. And now, at last, the question this video cannot answer for you, and that I've spent 2 hours circling. What do you do with this? Because you have a concrete case, we all do. You have someone who owes you an apology that's never going to arrive. You have money you're owed. You have a relative you don't speak to, and you're absolutely right. And I wouldn't dare argue with a single comma of your rightness. You have someone who hurt you, and you have a right, a legitimate, legal, recognized human right, to be compensated for it. And the man on the rock said to renounce that. He didn't say you weren't right. He never said that. He said to renounce the right that your rightness gives you. And the 5 escapes are all there right now, waiting for you, with the door open and a comfortable chair. You can use any of them. They're excellent. They're signed by Thomas Aquinas, by Luther, by Schweitzer. Nobody is going to judge you for picking one. I have used them. I told you so, and I didn't say it to look good. Bonhoeffer in the end chose something else. He chose to disobey knowing that he was disobeying, without an alibi, without a footnote, without a system to absolve him, carrying the guilt himself instead of leaving it to a theologian. And it seems to me that, terrible as it is more honest than the 5. Because the problem was never that people didn't fulfill that discourse. People don't fulfill anything. And we knew that before we opened the Bible. The problem is that we devoted 2,000 years to making sure we wouldn't have to feel bad about it. Before you go, tell me one thing in the comments, because I really am interested and I'm going to read them. Of the 5 escapes, which one is yours? The monk's one, the 2 kingdoms, the mirror, the end of the world, the other dispensation. We all have one. I already told you mine, and it cost me a fair amount to say it out loud. Tell me yours. And there's another video waiting for you on the screen right now. It's independent of this one. You don't need anything you've just heard to understand it, and I'm not going to tell you what it's about. I'll only tell you that if what you've seen today bothered you, that one is going to bother you more. Go back to the hillside a second. For the last time, the sun is high now, the grass is trodden, the crowd stands up, shakes out its clothes, gathers up the children, and starts to come down the mountain. And Matthew, in the next verse, chapter